Greetings from the Appalachian Mountains, where you will discover one of the most unsettling tales ever told. Now, leave a comment about where you're watching. In 1908, West Virginia's thick forests held mysteries that no map could disclose. There was a remote community where time seemed to slow down amid deep valleys and abandoned paths. Eliza Warren, a reclusive woman renowned for her understanding of medicinal herbs and ancestral rites that few dared to practice, lived there amid wooden cabins and oil lamps. Query: this film was made entirely for amusement and as a work of fiction. Any likeness to real people, alive or deceased, is entirely coincidental. Even in the middle of the day, Eliza's remote home was shaded by enormous fir trees. Few people went down the meandering path that led to her door because the closest neighbors were miles away. There was something in the air there that caused dogs to howl for no apparent reason and horses to recoil. The residents refrained from discussing her in public, but stories filtered through the local taverns and whispers at night. They claimed that Eliza had traveled to that area from an unidentified location, bringing only a tattered leather suitcase and a stare that seemed to cut right through people. She never provided an explanation, and no one was certain of her origins. As though she had always been a part of that dark place, she settled on that deserted property. She gradually started to get occasional visits from desperate people looking for treatments for conditions that traditional. There was nothing that medicine could do. Eliza lived in a strange house that had been constructed decades before by a recluse who had passed away for unknown reasons. The little light that did make it through the trees seemed to be absorbed by the dark wooden structure. No one outside could see inside due to the narrow windows with frosted glass. The property was bounded by an uneven fence of gray stones, and a rusty chain that creaked in the wind like a never-ending lament hung from the main gate. The inhabitants of the closest. Eliza's relationship with Webster Springs Village remained unclear. When inexplicable pains lingered for weeks, or when mysterious fevers afflicted their homes, some turned to her for help. She prepared her mixtures of plants harvested under the full moon, charged small fees for her services, and consistently received them. Numerous people vowed that her concoctions were more effective than any medications purchased in the town. Others, on the other hand, came back unsettled, mentioning odd symbols painted on the interior walls of the house and of sounds emanating from the basement that they were unable to identify. In that part of the Appalachians, the winter of 1908 was especially severe. Those who lived in the mountainous areas were further isolated by the thick layer of snow that covered the paths. Eliza went weeks without anyone seeing her. Even on the coldest days, her chimney, which typically emitted smoke, was left unlit. Some believed she had departed, leaving that hostile location in pursuit of less hostile regions. Others feared the worst, thinking that she was overcome by cold and loneliness. A traveling merchant who was passing through the area noticed that Eliza's house's door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind, as spring finally started to melt the layers of ice. He called her name cautiously, but all that came back was the echo of his own voice. As he pushed the door open, he saw a scene that would linger in his nightmares for years. The exterior of the house was undamaged, but there were indications of abrupt abandonment inside. Furniture was overturned, items were strewn everywhere, and there was a thick silence that seemed to contain an inexplicable weight. Curious bystanders and local authorities searched every room of that depressing home in the days that followed. They discovered intricate drawings etched into the wooden floor, handwritten books in languages no one knew, and bottles filled with liquids of impossible colors. They found something in the basement that would fundamentally alter their opinion of Eliza Warren. There were buildings there that indicated unidentified experiments, antiquated tools whose function no one could ascertain, and thorough notebook records of procedures that defied logical justification. The investigation was taken over by pragmatic Webster County Sheriff Thomas Blackwell. He tried to piece together Eliza's final movements, walked the property several times, and questioned everyone who had interacted with her. However, the more he looked into it, the more questions remained. There was no evidence of a struggle, no sign of a planned departure, and there was no proof of Eliza's whereabouts or what had actually transpired in that house during the winter. The documents discovered in Eliza's home showed a sophisticated and unnerving mind. Page after page of painstaking handwriting detailed practices that combined traditional knowledge with crude scientific observations, as well as rituals involving lunar cycles and star alignments. Blackwell tried to understand those writings for whole nights, but the language used alternated between archaic English and symbols that appeared to be part of an unidentified notation system. An impressive collection of botanical specimens was one of Eliza's possessions. Seeds in tiny linen bags, dried plants and roots preserved in glass jars. Some were immediately identifiable as common medicinal herbs in that Appalachian region, but others refused to be identified. Blackwell sought advice from a University of Virginia botany professor who occasionally traveled to Webster Springs, but even he acknowledged that he had never seen a few of those species. Their forms diverged from expected natural patterns, their colors were too intense, and their characteristics were too strange. The area of the house that most interested the researchers was the basement. This setting had been meticulously prepared, in contrast to the rest of the building. More durable boards were used to line the walls. There was a basic ventilation system that permitted air circulation even when the door was closed, and the floor was perfectly level. In the middle of the room's circular wood-engraved marks created geometric patterns that recurred in smaller sizes like waves emanating from a central point. They discovered candles that had been consumed to the last bits of wax around these marks, creating perfect circles. Months later, there was still a strong scent of incense in the air, a combination of woody and indefinable sweet notes. Labeled bottles on the sidewall shelves held materials that ranged from gray to powders to thick liquids with an amber hue. Although the names on each label were written in the same elaborate handwriting, none of the words fit any known vocabulary. In the months preceding the winter of 1908, Thomas Blackwell made the deliberate decision to interview every visitor to Eliza. The first was Martha Hensley, who operated a Webster Springs boarding house. In October of that year, Martha confessed to going to see Eliza to get treatment for joint pain that had been bothering her for months. She talked about the encounter, with a mix of thankfulness and discomfort. Martha claims that after greeting her with aloof friendliness, Eliza showed her to a back room where she held her consultations. There, in the light of carefully positioned lamps, Eliza spent many minutes examining her hands, touching particular spots, and whispering words that Martha couldn't make out. She then made an infusion with herbs from her garden and told Martha to drink it every night for 7 nights in a row, always before dusk. Martha did as she was told. To the letter, and astonishingly, the discomfort had greatly subsided. Martha was hesitant to disclose another thing, though. She eventually acknowledged, under pressure from Blackwell, that she had heard noises emanating from the basement while she was there. They sounded more like rhythmic vibrations than voices, as though there was machinery working somewhere in the house. She had asked Eliza about it, but all she had gotten was a mysterious smile and the remark that some secrets were better left unspoken. Daniel Cooper, a blacksmith from the suburbs of Webster Springs, was another frequent visitor. Over the years, Daniel had visited Eliza multiple times in search of cures for a variety of illnesses. He said Eliza was a quiet woman who paid close attention. She had a tendency to observe people in silence before diagnosing them, as though she could see past outward symptoms to find underlying imbalances. Daniel had observed a shift in Eliza's conduct during his most recent visit, which took place at the end of November. Clears throat. She appeared more detached, lost in her own thoughts that took her out of the moment. Eliza merely shook her head when he brought up the impending hard winter and advised her to think about spending those months in the village, where she would have more company and comfort. She mentioned a task that needed to be finished, a journey that required seclusion and particular circumstances that could only be found in that remote location. After several weeks, Blackwell gathered testimonies that, rather than providing clarification, only made the mystery more complex. There was a consensus among those who had known Eliza. She knew things that were beyond common sense. When other therapies didn't work, her potions did. She made unsettlingly accurate predictions about climate change. She could tell when someone was lying simply by looking at their body language, and she had the natural ability to win over doubtful people. Blackwell started to see that this was more than just an unexplained absence. There were more complex aspects to that tale, relationships that went beyond that mountain home. Eliza Warren was more than just a solitary healer. She was a part of a larger movement that had a subtle but unsettling impact on the Appalachian region. When Blackwell learned that Eliza kept up regular correspondence with people from various regions, the investigation took an unexpected turn. He discovered dozens of letters from the previous 3 years in a wooden box that was carefully guarded in the house's attic. From a small community in Oregon, missives arrived from as far away as Massachusetts, Louisiana, and even the West Coast. There was a fascinating pattern among them all. They treated Eliza as a very important person and were written in a tone that was almost reverent. Adelaide, a resident of Salem, Massachusetts, wrote one of the letters dated March 1907. She expressed gratitude to Eliza for sharing her understanding of the characteristics of particular plants that are unique to particular swamps at particular lunar phases. Adelaide stated that she had achieved remarkable outcomes by adhering to the instructions and requested permission to share that information with other reliable individuals in her area. The wording implied that there was a distinct network of people with related interests. Another particularly interesting letter was written by a man from New Orleans, Louisiana, who went by the name Solomon. The letter, which was written in November 1907, talked about a scheduled winter solstice meeting of the subsequent year. Other fraternity members would also be there, Solomon said, and it would be a special chance to talk about new developments in their methods. In order to avoid attracting attention, he stressed the value of discretion and recommended that each participant travel independently. Blackwell recognized that Eliza belonged to a group of individuals who were interested in research that combined astronomical observations, ritualistic practices, and herbal knowledge. It wasn't inherently evil, but undoubtedly out of the ordinary and hidden from the view of the majority. It was challenging for people outside the group to understand these people's language, veiled references, and subtle codes of communication. Eliza's personal journal was one of the documents. She appears to have arrived in that area of West Virginia in 1905, as evidenced by the earliest entries. The first entries were straightforward, detailing how she adapted to the mountainous environment, the challenges she faced growing her garden of medicinal herbs, and her initial encounters with the locals. However, the entry's tone underwent a significant shift as the months went by. During one of her collecting trips, Eliza wrote in June 1906 about discovering something in the nearby forests. She referred to the discovery as transformative, but she did not elaborate on what it was. She spoke of secret clearings where plants grew in peculiar ways, creating flawless spirals that couldn't have happened by accident. She mentioned sources of water with unusual qualities that can preserve some organic materials in a novel way. Additionally, she documented hearing noises on full moon nights that were unrelated to any local animals. Eliza's experiments in her basement were recorded in the following entries. She observed natural chemical reactions, tested combinations of plant materials, and carefully documented every outcome. There were thorough illustrations that demonstrated how various substances changed their characteristics in response to particular temperatures or bright moonlight. Eliza displayed a self-taught scientific approach that she most likely picked up from her correspondence with other people in that enigmatic network. Eliza wrote a particularly mysterious entry in December 1907, just over a year before she left. She said she was on the verge of finishing a project she had started decades ago in a different location and under different conditions. She described how portals would only open and cycles would close when astrological and geographic circumstances coincided. Exactly. Anxiety and resolve were evident in her writing, as though she were getting ready for a significant event. Blackwell presented his research to Edmund Hartley, the local judge, who was renowned for his curiosity and open-mindedness. Hartley studied the papers closely, making notes and posing queries that Blackwell had not thought of. Together, they started making links between the items discovered in the house, the diary entries, and the letters. A complicated image surfaced, implying that Eliza was engaged in something much more complex than straightforward complementary therapies. There were differing views in Webster Springs regarding Eliza. Some defended her, claiming that she had never hurt anyone and that many people had benefited from her unusual methods. Others voiced mistrust, recalling rumors of rituals performed at night and enigmatic guests who would sometimes show up on her property in the wee hours of the morning. A few felt that Eliza had just made the decision to go in search of new educational opportunities. And some people were afraid that during the winter months of seclusion, something horrible had occurred in that house. As winter gave way to spring, Blackwell realized he needed to step up his search. He put together teams of volunteers to search the woods around Eliza's land for any clue as to where she might be. They discovered abandoned paths and natural caverns in the rocky slopes, and even deserted buildings that were scattered throughout that mountainous area. But all they could hear was the wind whirling through the valleys like a never-ending lament, and the thick silence of the old trees. Blackwell continued to examine the documents Eliza had left behind, while the physical searches went on without finding anything. Fragments of a greater narrative were revealed in every letter, journal entry, and note in the book's margins. He started to realize that Eliza Warren wasn't a singular person in the mountains of Appalachia. She was a link in a nationwide network of people who exchanged knowledge that had been passed down through the ages and kept out of the public eye. The investigation underwent unanticipated changes in the spring of 1909. One visitor, identified as Jonathan Pierce, an academic who corresponded with Eliza, came to Webster Springs from Massachusetts. He had a careful, sober appearance, metal-rimmed glasses, and a stance that transmitted information gathered over many years of research. He showed real concern for Eliza's protracted silence by going straight to Blackwell. Jonathan clarified that he belonged to the same group of academics that were referenced in the discovered letters. They were individuals bound together by a shared interest in traditional customs, the study of natural phenomena, and the preservation of knowledge that contemporary society tended to reject as superstition rather than a formal organization. Eliza. He claimed to be one of the most committed of them, with knowledge of some fields that was superior to that of many who had spent decades studying those fields. Jonathan followed Blackwell to the mountain house. With reverent attention, the visitor moved through each room, touching items as if they were familiar acquaintances. He sat quietly for several minutes in the basement, looking at the jar-lined shelves and the designs carved into the floor. At last, he faced Blackwell with an expression of worry combined with what might be seen as awe or admiration. Jonathan disclosed that Eliza was engaged in a large-scale project concerning the convergence of natural cycles. She thought she had discovered a particular time when celestial positions and turic energies came together to create special circumstances that only happened once every few decades. She hypothesized that this alignment would enable experiments that would not be feasible in other situations. Winter of 1908 was exactly one of these infrequent occasions. Jonathan was asked by Blackwell what these experiments were exactly. The guest paused, picking his words wisely. He clarified that the group they were a part of aimed to explore the boundaries between the tangible and the intangible, and to comprehend the connections between various planes of existence. It was not magic in the fantastical sense, but rather seeing and possibly engaging with facets of reality that were not yet understood by traditional science. Created tools for measurement or comprehension. Jonathan stayed in Webster Springs for the next few weeks, helping Blackwell interpret Eliza's documents. They were able to decipher some of the codes she used in her notes together. They found that many of the plants she grew were rare species, some of which were thought to be extinct in other parts of the world, preserved by cultivation methods she had picked up from earlier mentors. These plants had special chemical characteristics that, when mixed correctly, produced unexpected impacts on human awareness. Jonathan related tales of other circle members who had devoted their lives to comparable research in various eras and locations. A man from Tennessee was able to use patterns in rock formations to make remarkably accurate predictions about climate change. Despite all botanical expectations, a woman in Vermont kept a garden in which plants from various continents coexisted peacefully. An Arizona elder learned how to navigate the desert, founded on centuries' worth of astronomical knowledge that the indigenous peoples have passed down. Jonathan claims that these individuals didn't pursue notoriety or renown. They led quiet lives, upholding customs and delving into mysteries out of a sincere desire to learn. Eliza was a perfect fit for this profile. She had picked that remote Appalachian location specifically because it provided the perfect environment for her studies. Remoteness, terrain that is energetically favorable, and closeness to natural water sources with particular mineral properties. On a single, Jonathan and Blackwell discovered a notebook concealed beneath a loose floorboard in Eliza's room during their afternoons spent working together. The final months of 1908, which are not included in the main diary, were recorded in this notebook. Eliza had stepped up her preparations as the winter solstice drew near, according to the notes. She talked about feeling as though she was being watched not by actual people, but by entities she could only sense when she was deeply meditating. Eliza wrote about communicating with something that was not visible to the naked eye. She used metaphors pertaining to vibrations, frequencies, and resonances in her abstract descriptions. She said she would be given instructions on what to do on the night of the solstice, when the alignment of the stars would be at its best. Her words had a sense of urgency, as though she was aware that this chance would not come again in her physical life. The notebook's final entry was made on December 21, 1908, precisely on the day of the winter. The solstice. In her brief letter, Eliza stated that everything was ready. The basement, according to her, was a transformed area where she had gathered the symbolic, mineral, and vegetal components required for what she called the crossing. Although she did not define this term precisely, her writing exuded a sense of calm and expectation. Blackwell and Jonathan's final words were simply, "May this portal lead me to what I have sought throughout this journey." Exchanged, implication-filled looks. Both of them realized that they were dealing with an issue that defied easy explanation. Eliza had not fallen prey to outside forces. In accordance with her beliefs and research, she had purposefully planned an experiment that would take her to a different location or state of being. Since it was impossible to tell if this experiment had been successful, or if something had gone wrong, Jonathan proposed that maybe it would be wise to leave the house as it was, turning it into a kind of sanctuary that has been preserved. Blackwell, however, had legal obligations to take into account. Without at least attempting to provide the county authorities with a conclusion, he was unable to simply close the case. Knowing that any choice they made would have long-term effects, the two men discussed the best course of action in great detail. Other things started happening in Webster Springs that made things more difficult, while Blackwell and Jonathan discussed what to do next. Locals claimed to have had odd encounters while passing by Eliza's property. Despite being aware that the house was officially unoccupied, a shopkeeper reported seeing pale lights passing by the windows in the early morning. A farmer claimed to have heard melodies coming from that direction, songs carried by the night wind in unfamiliar languages. At first, Blackwell ascribed these reports to the collective imagination, which was stimulated by the stories that were being told about Eliza. However, when he chose to stay overnight, from a distance, he observed the property and saw things that defied logic. A few degrees colder than usual for the season, the temperature seemed off around the house. The air had a strange quality, an atmospheric density that made breathing seem more difficult. When Jonathan heard these stories, he was not surprised. He clarified that areas where individuals practiced intense energy concentration frequently developed lingering traits. It seemed as though Eliza's actions and intentions had penetrated that area in a way that went beyond the tangible. He likened the phenomenon to how some historical locations have a unique atmosphere that carries remnants of the past that are unwilling to entirely fade. After learning of these incidents, Judge Hartley recommended a practical course of action. He suggested that the house be temporarily closed to the public so that they could decide on an official course of action. Blackwell concurred, personally supervising all. Doors. However, reports of strange activity persisted despite locked doors and sealed windows. They grew more intense, if anything. A surprising turn of events in May 1909 gave the case a fresh viewpoint. Blackwell was approached by Grace Thornton, an elderly woman who claimed to know pertinent details about Eliza. Grace knew almost everyone in the mountains because she had lived there for more than 40 years. Eliza wasn't the first person to occupy that property for similar purposes, she disclosed. As stated by Grace, that same house had been occupied by a lone man named Silas Crowther decades before, in the 1870s. Although people were even more reticent about things deemed unusual at the time, Silas was also well known for its peculiar customs. He kept exotic plants, entertained at night, and sat in his basement for hours doing things no one could really comprehend. Silas just vanished one winter night, leaving the house empty but undamaged. That was not the end of the story. Grace stated that. By looking through old documents her family had preserved, she had learned that a group of Europeans had already selected that land in the early 1800s, before Silas. They had constructed the house's original structure in accordance with exact geometric specifications, orienting it in accordance with particular solar positions. None of its residents had picked that spot at random. The topography, the mineral makeup of the soil, or the groundwater confluence all contributed to it. Unique. Jonathan clearly found this information fascinating. He clarified that people in his circle were aware of locations that were thought to be natural portals, places where the boundaries between various aspects of life became more pliable. These were uncommon places that were frequently discovered by generations of experimentation and observation. Eliza most likely was aware of the property's history and special qualities when she selected it. Blackwell started to view the case entirely differently. Viewpoint. He was looking into a recent development in a series of events that lasted more than a century, not a singular incident. Using knowledge passed down through distinct lineages of practitioners, every individual who had lived in that house sought something similar. Eliza was just the most recent in a line of explorers to set foot on these enigmatic frontiers. Jonathan declared in June of that year that he would have to return to Massachusetts, but would be leaving Blackwell permanently. Contact details. He wanted to know about any developments right away. Before departing, he recommended that the house be kept as a storehouse of important information, rather than as a crime scene. He suggested that eventually, the Circle members could examine the materials that Eliza had left behind. Blackwell gave the idea careful thought, hoping to learn from her experiences and possibly carry on the work she had started. He understood that he was not technically capable of understanding everything Eliza had abandoned. However, he had a duty as a law enforcement official to provide a formal conclusion of some sort. He made the decision to compile the observable facts into a report. The materials discovered, the testimonies gathered, Eliza's absence, and the condition of her property. He only declared the case as one of absence under unknown circumstances, avoiding speculation about her fate. A brief calm was brought about by summer. Unusual occurrences reported near the property declined in frequency, but they didn't completely stop. Slowly, the residents of Webster Springs turned back to their daily concerns. Some turned Eliza Warren into a local legend, a mysterious person who had defied conventions and vanished under mysterious circumstances, even though her name was still occasionally discussed on tavern nights. But for Blackwell, the case continued to occupy his mind. Eliza's notebooks were stored in his office, and he periodically went back to them in the hopes of learning some previously unnoticed information. He was captivated by a certain wisdom in those records, a perspective that went against the strict frameworks he had grown up in. He started to doubt his own beliefs about the nature of reality, realizing that there might be facets of human experience that were either disregarded or mocked by mainstream society. Grace Thornton started going to Blackwell's office on a regular basis, sharing more tales about the obscure past of that mountainous area. She mentioned water, sources that the indigenous peoples who lived on those lands centuries before European colonization revered. She spoke of unusual acoustic rock formations, where sounds exhibited surprising behaviors. She also spoke of deep caverns that no one ventured to fully explore for fear of becoming lost in the underground mazes that protruded beneath the Appalachian Mountains. Blackwell's perception of the whole situation underwent a dramatic change in the fall of 1909. Throughout one of his discussions with Grace Thornton, she said, adding something she hadn't said before. She claimed that approximately 3 kilometers from Eliza's property, a rock formation had a set of symbols engraved on it. Hunters had found these symbols many years earlier, but no one had ever been able to decipher their meaning or trace their origin. Blackwell made the decision to look into it himself. He hiked gracefully alongside steep trails until he came to a limestone outcrop that was partially obscured by thick vegetation. There, the rocks shielded them from the weather. Natural protrusions were carved features that were obviously not the result of erosion. They were intricate geometric symbols, spirals that grew into mathematical patterns, entwined circles, and characters that looked like writing but didn't fit into any alphabet that Blackwell was aware of. Grace clarified that these symbols may have been left by indigenous cultures that once called those mountains home, predating the arrival of European colonists. However, there was also proof that subsequent guests had added their own inscriptions, resulting in layers of meaning that persisted over time. Blackwell recognized the symbols' resemblance to some of the drawings in Eliza's notebooks and mentally photographed them. This finding supported the idea that Eliza was part of a much older tradition rather than working independently. She had researched information that had been passed down through the ages and modified it to fit her own requirements and comprehensions. In addition to being her home, that area of the Appalachians was selected as a sacred site for its inherent qualities, which have been acknowledged by various groups over time. Jonathan Pierce sent Blackwell a letter in October. The scholar told him that after discussing the case's progress with other circle members, 3 of them had indicated a desire to travel to Webster Springs and inspect Eliza's property in person. Jonathan promised complete collaboration with local authorities and asked for official authorization for these researchers to enter the house and carry out their own research. Authorities and a dedication to keeping everything exactly as it was discovered. Blackwell discussed the request with Judge Hartley. Following discussion, they agreed to permit the visit under close supervision. 3 guests came to Webster Springs in November of that year. Despite their unremarkable appearance, their conversations demonstrated remarkable intellectual depth. They identified themselves as Samuel, an astronomy expert, and Margaret, an elderly botany scholar from Baltimore, and Sacred Geometry, who lived in Charleston, and Thomas, who had come from Savannah and was an expert on oral traditions and lost languages. This group painstakingly investigated every square inch of Eliza's land for a week. They identified species in the garden plants that Blackwell was unaware of. They took careful measurements and took copious notes as they examined the markings in the basement. They examined the notebooks, translating sections that had not yet been understood, and they went to the surrounding areas that Grace mentioned, creating links between the home and the area's natural energy points. Margaret disclosed that a large number of the plants that Eliza had grown were thought to be extinct. Some were said to have been extinct for centuries, despite being mentioned in medieval European herbaria. Others seemed to be cultivars created by selective breeding methods that were refined over many generations. As a result, Eliza's garden served as both a practical area and a living repository of botanical knowledge that has been gathered over time. Samuel concentrated on the property's geometric features and architecture. He found that certain astronomical alignments exactly matched the orientation of the house. The windows were oriented so that specific points within would receive sunlight on specific dates throughout the year. The basement was constructed in accordance with the geometric proportions found in many ancient cultures' sacred buildings. The construction was not haphazard. Every component was served with care, deliberate goals. Eliza's writings, particularly those in obscure languages or codes, captured Thomas's attention. He was able to locate references to Gnostic traditions, fragments of ancient Celtic languages, and components of knowledge systems that Hermetic communities had preserved throughout European history. Eliza created her own hybrid system by combining traditional knowledge with contemporary empirical observation by synthesizing information from various sources. When the week came to an end, the 3 guests met with. Blackwell and Hartley will discuss their findings. They clarified that even among the most devoted practitioners of their fields, Eliza had attained a level of understanding that is rarely attained. Decades of planning and research had gone into the work she had done in that house. The 1908 winter solstice event was the result of a well-thought-out plan rather than an act of whimsy. Margaret speculated that Eliza may have created such a profoundly altered state of consciousness in herself that her typical perceptions were totally changed. Samuel suggested that she might have been attempting to achieve a kind of physical transcendence by aligning her own life energy with more significant cosmic patterns. Thomas thought that by using her body as a tool for exploration, she was attempting to gain access to realms of knowledge that are outside the realm of ordinary sensory perception. None of them asserted that they were certain of what had occurred. They all agreed on one thing, even though they were aware of the boundaries of their own comprehension. Eliza Warren possessed, not fallen prey to unfortunate events. She had been the active lead character in her own story, working toward objectives that were extremely important to her. Her absence was a question that touched on the boundaries of what human reason can understand about existence and consciousness, rather than a mystery to be solved by traditional investigative techniques. Blackwell was receptive to these viewpoints. Over the course of that year, his worldview had been severely tested. He had started the inquiry with the intention of discover simple solutions, such as proof of a crime or hints about a planned escape. Rather, he had come across infinity-deep layers of complexity that prompted philosophical inquiries concerning the nature of reality and the boundaries of human experience. Carrying authorized copies of some of Eliza's documents, the three visitors departed Webster Springs with the intention of studying them and eventually disseminating their findings to a larger group of academics. Additionally, they left thorough instructions on how to preserve the chemical and organic materials discovered on the land, guaranteeing that Eliza's legacy could be preserved for future generations. Winter had returned to Appalachia, carrying with it memories of Eliza's last recorded experiment from the year before. Blackwell would frequently find himself staring at the deserted property as the snow covered the roof and turned the garden into a blanket of white. This recurring pattern had a poetic quality, as though the natural world was silently honoring the someone who had devoted her life to deciphering its most profound mysteries. All of the materials gathered during the investigation were painstakingly organized by Blackwell during the cold months. Photographs of the symbols discovered in the rock formations, Eliza's notebook transcripts, copies of correspondence with circle members, and thorough accounts of the scholar's visits were all part of his extensive archive. His objective had shifted from solving a criminal case to accurately record a phenomenon that went beyond traditional legal classification categories. In this documentation process, Grace Thornton emerged as a crucial partner. She had a remarkable recall of what had happened in that area over many years, and her stories provided important historical background for new findings. She told tales of other eccentric people who had lived in those mountains, each leaving their own unique mark on the landscape during long afternoons spent in Blackwell's office, community's cultural tapestry. Grace mentioned a musician who had resided there in the 1880s and played instruments fashioned from organic materials gathered from the forests. Witnesses at the time claimed that his melodies had peculiar qualities. After listening to them, people claimed to experience profound tranquility, seeing vibrant images even when their eyes are closed. Although the musician kept notebooks full of musical notations, he never disclosed the source of his knowledge. That did not adhere to traditional compositional systems. Another was a painter who had made the area his temporary home in the 1890s. Although she painted canvases depicting local landscapes, she included details that viewers could not see with the naked eye. Things that appeared to live in the areas between light and shadow, geometric shapes that drifted among the trees, and colors that weren't part of the normal visible spectrum. While many believed her creations were the result of a frenzied imagination, others vowed they saw more genuine facets of reality in them that were only perceptible to acute sensibilities. A recurring pattern emerged from these tales. People who lived on the periphery of social consensus regarding reality were either drawn to or produced in that area of the Appalachians. They were sincere investigators of facets of human experience that pragmatic society frequently overlooks, not lunatics or charlatans. Perhaps the most elegant and deliberate manifestation of this tradition, Eliza was a perfect fit. Within, the Salem woman mentioned in the letters discovered at Eliza's home, Adelaide, wrote to Blackwell in February 1910. Adelaide was aware that authorities might read her letter, as evidenced by the care with which she wrote. She expressed gratitude for the documentation work Blackwell was doing, acknowledging the rarity of finding a law enforcement representative willing to address such sensitive matters with an open mind and respect. Adelaide shared that the circle of scholars to which she belonged was organizing a compilation of knowledge preserved by its members. It would be an extensive work bringing together practices, observations, and theories developed over generations. She requested permission to include references to Eliza's work, naturally omitting details that could specifically identify her or compromise her posthumous privacy. Blackwell readily agreed, recognizing that preserving that knowledge had value that transcended bureaucratic considerations. The following months brought a gradual return to normalcy too. Life in Webster Springs. Eliza's property remained sealed but preserved, becoming a local landmark about which people spoke with a mixture of respect and unease. Occasionally, travelers interested in esoteric matters arrived in the village seeking information about her, drawn by rumors that circulated discreetly among communities of practitioners throughout the country. Blackwell developed a protocol for dealing with these visitors. She received them cordially, but shared only basic information, protecting both Eliza's privacy and the integrity of the investigation. Some demonstrated impressive knowledge of the practices in which she was involved, confirming through their questions and comments that her work had significant relevance for those who dedicated their lives to similar studies. One of these visitors, an elderly man from Missouri, who identified himself only as Nathaniel, brought a particularly interesting perspective. He explained that there were several locations scattered throughout the United States considered natural portals. These places possess specific geological and energetic characteristics that made them ideal for certain practices. Mountains, due to their altitude and mineral composition, often served as amplifiers of directed human intentions. Nathaniel described how experienced practitioners developed a sensitivity to identify these locations. It wasn't a matter of conventional geographical mapping, but rather of attunement to environmental subtleties that most people simply didn't perceive. Eliza, according to him, possessed this sensitivity to an exceptional degree. She had likely traveled extensive distances before finding that specific spot in the Appalachians, instantly recognizing its unique qualities. During the conversation, Nathaniel mentioned something that made Blackwell reconsider entire aspects of the investigation. He suggested that the periodic absences documented in the history of that property were not tragic coincidences, but rather successes. Each person who had inhabited that place, and eventually disappeared, could have achieved the goal they sought. Physical absence would not necessarily mean death or tragedy, but rather a transition to alternative states of existence. This perspective profoundly challenged Blackwell's fundamental assumptions. He had always operated within a paradigm that viewed death as the ultimate end and absence as a problem to be solved. Nathaniel proposed a vision in which human consciousness could exist in forms not limited by physical corporeality, and that sufficiently prepared individuals could deliberately move between different modes of being. Blackwell questioned Nathaniel about evidence for such claims. The visitor responded with analogies. He explained that just as people blind from birth cannot fully comprehend descriptions of color until they eventually gain sight, individuals who have never experienced altered states of consciousness cannot adequately evaluate accounts from those who have. Direct experience was the only path to genuine understanding, and that experience required preparation, discipline, and courage. Before leaving, Nathaniel entrusted Blackwell with a small, leather-bound volume. It was a collection of texts on perennial philosophies found in different cultural traditions throughout history. Hindus, Buddhists, Sufis, Christian mystics, European Hermeticists, American shamanic traditions all shared similar conceptions about the multidimensional nature of reality and the human capacity to transcend ordinary limitations through dedicated practices. Blackwell spent weeks absorbing that material. Each page opened new horizons of thought, challenging certainties he had carried throughout his life. He began to question not only Eliza's case, but the very nature of his existence and purpose. Why was he here? What constituted a life well lived? Were there really boundaries beyond those imposed by ordinary sensory perception? These reflections subtly transformed his approach to daily work. He became more contemplative, less quick to judge situations based solely on superficial appearances. He developed greater patience with witnesses who reported unusual experiences, recognizing that reality could be far more complex than his formal training had prepared him to accept. Grace observed these changes with quiet approval. In one of their conversations, she remarked that perhaps the true purpose of Eliza's case wasn't to be solved in the conventional sense, but rather to serve as a catalyst for transformation for those who approached it with sincerity. Blackwell smiled at this, recognizing the wisdom contained in the observation. He had truly been transformed by that investigation in ways he had never anticipated. The spring of 1910 brought renewal not only to the Appalachian landscape, but also to the investigation Blackwell was conducting. In March of that year, he made a decision that would fundamentally change his relationship with the case. He decided to spend an entire night on Eliza's property, not as an investigator seeking evidence, but as an observer, willing to experience that space in the way she likely had experienced it. He prepared himself carefully for this experience. He took with him only a lantern, water, and Eliza's notebooks, which he had studied exhaustively. He arrived at the house at twilight when the shadows of the mountains began to swallow the valleys, and the first nocturnal sounds of the forest awakened. The dark wooden structure received him in silence, its windows reflecting the last rays of sunlight like half-open eyes. Blackwell settled into the main room, sitting precisely where he imagined Eliza usually meditated. He could feel the density of the air around him, that peculiar quality so many people had mentioned. As the hours passed, his senses began to adjust to the environment. Small sounds that initially seemed random revealed rhythmic patterns. The temperature fluctuated in subtle but perceptible ways, and there was an indefinable sense of presence, not threatening, but undeniably real. During that night, Blackwell did not witness any dramatic supernatural phenomena. There were none. Spectral apparitions or inexplicable physical manifestations. But he experienced something equally significant, a gradual transformation of his own consciousness. As he remained still, breathing calmly and keeping his mind open, perceptions that normally lay in the background became vividly present. He sensed the earth's faint tremor beneath his feet, a steady throb that appeared to come from the depths of the geology. He heard layers of sounds that he usually filtered unconsciously. The movement of small animals on the walls, the imperceptible settling of the wooden structure, the flow of air through microscopic cracks, and at some point during the hours before dawn, he experienced a sensation of expansion, as if the boundaries of his individual identity became porous and permeable. When the sun rose, Blackwell emerged from the house transformed. He couldn't precisely articulate what he had experienced, but he knew for sure that his understanding of reality had been permanently altered. Now he understood. Eliza's motivation for dedicating her life to those studies was visceral rather than intellectual. Human consciousness had access to layers of experience that far exceeded what was accepted as real in traditional culture. In the following days, he shared this experience with Grace Thornton. She paid close attention, occasionally nodding as though she recognized something. When he finished, Grace revealed that she herself had spent nights in that place decades before, when Silas Crowther still lived there. Their experiences had been similar in that they felt as though the boundaries between themselves and their surroundings were blurring, and that they were more aware of the subtleties of reality. According to Grace, these altered states of consciousness were latent abilities that each and every person possessed, rather than abnormal or pathological. With the constant demands of fragmented attention in modern life, these skills tend to deteriorate. but anyone can rediscover them with the correct mindset and in the right conditions. Eliza had just devoted her life to methodically developing these abilities, raising them to a level that few people could attain. Solomon, the New Orleans man whose letter had been discovered in Eliza's mail, paid Blackwell a visit in April. Solomon showed up without warning, walking straight to the sheriff's office with a dignified and assured bearing. He clarified that the group of academics was planning a memorial service for Eliza, and they wanted Blackwell to take part. Blackwell was reluctant at first, but finally consented. The event would be held in June at a remote property in the Tennessee mountains, where circle members from various areas would congregate. Solomon reassured him that there would be no evil or unlawful activity, just people gathering to exchange knowledge, pay tribute to a devoted practitioner, and celebrate customs they had upheld. Blackwell set out to travel to Tennessee when June arrived. The property selected for the event was situated in a secluded valley that could only be reached by winding paths that wound between towering rock formations. When he got there, about 20 people had already assembled. They were ordinary-looking men and women of different ages, but they all had a certain depth and presence. Blackwell took part in interesting conversations for 3 days. Those in attendance talked about their personal encounters with Eliza-like practices. They discussed meditation methods that have been handed down through astronomical observations that showed cosmic patterns influencing terrestrial rhythms, generations, and techniques for working with plants that enhanced altered states of consciousness. They respected one another based on experience and commitment, but there was no official hierarchy between them. The scholars who had come to Webster Springs, Margaret, Samuel, and Thomas were there, as was Jonathan Pierce. Additionally, there were practitioners that Blackwell was unfamiliar with, each contributing their own viewpoints. An Arizona woman imparted knowledge about using instinctive navigation to follow unseen energy currents across deserts. A man from Maine talked about his studies on the acoustics of specific rock formations along the coast where sound waves from the ocean produced frequencies that could induce profound states of meditation. Adelaide, the Salem correspondent, presided over Eliza's memorial service. It was a group recognition of the legacy she had left behind, not religion in the traditional sense. Each individual briefly discussed the ways in which Eliza's work had impacted their individual roots. They spoke of her with both reverence and joy, celebrating a successful transition to something they all hoped to comprehend rather than a loss. Solomon read a few passages from Eliza's notebooks during the ceremony. In that group of focused listeners, her words from years ago, written in solitude on a mountain, struck a chord. She talked about the human quest for purpose, the bravery required to challenge social norms, and the beauty of fully committing oneself to examining the most. Mysteries of life. Her writing was filled with calm resolve and unquenchable curiosity rather than fear. That shared experience moved Blackwell deeply. He didn't feel alone in his fears for the first time since he started his research. He was surrounded by people who understood the extraordinary case he had become involved in, who validated his experiences, and who shared his questions. On her journey, Eliza was not by herself. She belonged to a huge and long-standing custom that would endure far beyond any one person. The group gathered around a campfire under a stunningly clear, starry sky on the last night of the event. Conversations naturally shifted between commonplace subjects and deep introspection. Simple melodies that blended in perfectly with the sounds of the night forest were played on a wooden flute. As he observed the dancing flames, Blackwell felt a connection to a lineage spanning centuries as well as to those in attendance. Thousands of individuals who committed their lives to going beyond the typical bounds of human existence. When Blackwell returned to Webster Springs following the Tennessee meeting, he had a whole new outlook. The journey had involved more than just a change of location. It symbolized a shift in perspective from a paradigm constrained by social norms to one that embraced infinitely greater possibilities. He was no longer merely a sheriff looking into an enigmatic absence. In a sense, he had taken on the role of steward of a legacy that went beyond any administrative or legal classification. The summer went by in a different way. Blackwell continued to fulfill his professional obligations, but he used every spare moment to thoroughly examine the materials Eliza had left behind. Instead of looking for answers in the traditional sense, he now sought a true comprehension of the ideas that underpinned his work. Layers of meaning were revealed by each symbol in his notebooks. That had stayed hidden before. Every note on medicinal plants contained advanced pharmacological information gleaned from meticulous testing. During this learning process, Grace Thornton served as her mentor. Eliza's theoretical studies were well complemented by her practical knowledge of the Appalachian Mountains. They started mapping the region's energetically significant locations together. They discovered rock formations that enhanced sounds, water sources with distinctive mineral characteristics in strange paths and groves where plants grew, exhibiting organic geometric patterns that alluded to profound subterranean influences. Grace showed Blackwell a cave that few people were aware of during one of these July explorations. The entrance was discreet, only reachable by a steep descent between loose rocks and partially obscured by thick bushes. But once inside, the cave revealed a spacious room with a high ceiling held up by stalactite formations that looked like the columns of a natural temple. The room's acoustics were exceptional. Other earthly harmonies were created by the prolonged and amplified echo of a whisper that was produced in a corner. According to Grace, native peoples who lived in the area centuries ago were aware of the location. Utilizing its inherent acoustic qualities to create altered states of consciousness, they employed it for chanting and percussion-based ceremonies. Knowledge about this location was lost with the arrival of European colonists and was only preserved through oral traditions passed down through generations of mountain dwellers like her family. For hours, Blackwell stayed in that cave. He could sense why such places were revered as he experienced its distinct atmosphere. The air had a certain density, as if it held memories of everyone who had visited before. He envisioned Eliza coming here, maybe exploring on her own, and establishing a direct connection with ancestors' customs by being in the natural setting. In August, Adelaide wrote to Blackwell to let him know that the previously mentioned compilation of knowledge was going well. A number of the Circle's members had submitted manuscripts outlining their specialties. The resultant volume might be hundreds of pages long, making it a substantial work. Adelaide asked Blackwell if he would think about penning a chapter about Eliza's case, sharing his distinct viewpoint as an investigator who had moved from skepticism to comprehension. Blackwell was fascinated by the idea. He knew he had a special story to tell, but he had never thought of himself as a writer. As a representative of established law, it was uncommon for someone in his position to so wholeheartedly adopt a worldview that went against prevailing cultural orthodoxies. His story could act as a link between traditional and alternative viewpoints, enabling people who are still constrained by constrictive paradigms to better understand difficult concepts. Blackwell committed himself to the task in September. Of composition, he found that putting experiences into words improved his comprehension. He had to describe the changes he had gone through on the inside as well as the outside. How to characterize that evening at Eliza's house when everyday perceptions vanished into something more expansive. How to express the sense of connection felt during the Tennessee encounter. When distinctions between individualities appeared arbitrary and manufactured. The text he wrote during that month was unexpected. Him with its very truthfulness. He wrote about his early misgivings, his unquestioned biases, and the mental obstacles he had to get past in order to welcome new possibilities. He portrayed Eliza as a committed individual who pursued her beliefs to the end, rather than as a mysterious and aloof person. And he considered what it meant to live a genuine life, following one's own convictions even when they went against social norms. Early in October, she dispatched the manuscript to Adelaide. A few weeks later, she was given an enthusiastic response. She commended the bravery of her vulnerability and the lucidity of her writing. Similar feelings were expressed by other circle members who had read the text. Because it was written by someone who was initially outside of those traditions, some people remarked that her chapter might be the most significant part of the compilation. Her metamorphosis served as an example of the opportunities available to anyone who is prepared to challenge self-imposed constraints. About 2 years after Eliza's death, in November 1910, Blackwell made another important choice. He created a formal agreement for the preservation of Eliza's property with the consent of the Circle of Scholars and Judge Hartley. Authorized circle members could occasionally visit the house for study, but only under strict supervision and with a dedication to maintaining its integrity. The house would be kept exactly as it was, effectively turning it into a living archive of esoteric knowledge. Grace Thornton consented to be the caregiver in the area of the land. She was still able to walk the mountain trails despite her advanced age, and her extensive local knowledge allowed her to properly preserve that unique area. Blackwell contributed a small amount of money for routine upkeep, which kept the windows sealed against the weather and the roof waterproof. Blackwell thought a great deal about the nature of his investigation over the course of the next winter. Traditional police investigations looked for clear-cut answers and offenders discovered, criminals apprehended, and mysteries resolved using linear causal chains. This model was totally broken in Eliza's case. The more the mystery was investigated, the more it became clear that there was no crime and no guilty parties. However, this did not indicate that the investigation was unsuccessful. Instead of being a definitive conclusion, it actually signified a different kind of success, a broader understanding. Throughout his career, he started to wonder how many more cases might have benefited from a similar strategy. How many circumstances are truly deemed inexplicable? Held different logics that observers caught in limited paradigms were unable to see. Maybe an investigator's real job wasn't always to close cases, but sometimes to open them in ways that uncovered possibilities that hadn't been considered before. Jonathan Pierce returned to Webster Springs in January 1911. He brought word that the knowledge compilation was almost finished. The book would only be published in a restricted quantity and given to circle members and particular institutions that showed a sincere desire to protect underrepresented customs. They wanted to make sure that this knowledge would not be lost over the course of generations, not to gain notoriety or widespread recognition. Jonathan also mentioned that younger circle members were becoming more interested in setting up permanent study spaces. Eliza's Appalachian property could be used as a template for other comparable areas across the nation, where committed professionals could carry out research away from contemporary. Distractions, delving deeply into the natural world while investigating the limits of human awareness. Blackwell embraced this vision wholeheartedly. He understood that Eliza's legacy should be a living source of inspiration for generations to come, rather than just being preserved in a static manner. Her mountain home could become a place of pilgrimage for people who want to comprehend the path she had taken, not to blindly follow her, but to discover their own versions of comparable journeys. Throughout the Blackwell started to receive more and more visitors in the spring of 1911. People came to Webster Springs in search of information after learning about the case through the Circle's discrete networks. He honed his ability to discern between sincere, inquisitive people and sensationalists looking only for macabre amusement. He generously shared his acquired knowledge and granted the sincere, supervised access to the property. Among these, one of the visitors, a young Pennsylvanian woman named Catherine, was especially interested. She was starting her own exploration and looking for mentors to help her along the way. Blackwell saw in her the same intensity he thought had defined Eliza when she was younger. He spent a good deal of time talking to Catherine, responding to her inquiries and sharing insights derived from his own recent changes. During her 2 weeks in Webster Springs, Catherine took in as much as she could. Learn. She made several visits to Eliza's estate, each time with the proper respect. Under Grace's supervision, she visited the important natural sites and worked long hours in Blackwell's office, looking through copies of letters and notebooks. She conveyed her sincere gratitude before departing, saying that the experience had illuminated her own path in unexpected ways. Blackwell was filled with mixed emotions as he watched Catherine go. He was happy, on the one hand, to have helped someone else's travel. However, he also realized that his own position was evolving. He had unintentionally turned into a kind of gatekeeper, allowing access to knowledge that had been preserved while preserving its integrity. Although he hadn't sought the responsibility, he accepted it with growing seriousness. In the years that followed, Blackwell came to peacefully accept the nature of the case that had changed his life. At last, he realized that some stories are not meant for definitive resolutions. They are there to serve as a reminder that reality is much more expansive than our limited categories can represent. Eliza Warren had made a singular decision motivated by inquiries that went beyond accepted theories. The mountain estate continued to stand as a silent reminder of that incredible adventure. Occasional guests kept coming in, drawn by something indescribable that emanated from that location. Each of them took with them bits of inspiration and questions that might sprout in their own lives. Grace continued her devoted watch. Aging gracefully, she told anyone who listened to her tales of the mountains. Blackwell started to view his work entirely differently. Every case that came across his desk was now more than just an administrative issue that needed to be resolved. It was a chance to identify the person responsible for the situation. Certain situations turned out to be straightforward, while others were complicated, and some even touched on those enigmatic boundaries where questions grow and certainties vanish. The seasons persisted in their never-ending cycle. Throughout the Appalachians, the forests were renewed by the springs. The valleys were bathed in golden light during the summer. Winters shrouded everything in white blankets of silence, while autumns painted the slopes in colors that were impossible to imagine. Eliza's house was still standing, a lonely edifice surrounded by old trees, preserving mysteries that might never be fully known, but would always motivate those who dared to approach with respect. What transpired on that solstice will never be known for sure. 1908 at night. Eliza might have succeeded in her goals, or she might have lost herself in the process. But maybe that's exactly the point. Some journeys are about having the guts to go out and find something bigger than ourselves, not about where we end up. Something that goes against everything we've been taught to believe is possible and real. Eliza Warren's story reverberates throughout history as an invitation rather than a tragedy. An invitation to consider, investigate, and acknowledge that the boundaries of our experience are frequently walls that we have constructed ourselves. This is just one of the many secrets the Appalachian Mountains have to offer to those who are prepared to hear what the quiet whispers. Blackwell spent the remainder of his life with the peace that came from having touched something extraordinary, even if only momentarily. He discovered that pursuing real mysteries can sometimes lead to their transformation rather than their resolution. And that might be the most important lesson any story can teach. Make an offer. Consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment with your thoughts on this tale if you have followed along with us this far. Every viewpoint gives stories that defy easy explanations, a deeper level of comprehension. Until the next tale that guides us through the mysteries of the past and its shadows.